Welcome to The Midnight Secrets. The Echoing Laughter. In the early 2000s, the town of Greendale was abuzz with excitement as the new Crescent Mall opened its doors. This massive shopping complex promised to be the ultimate destination for all things trendy, attracting visitors from neighboring towns as well. The mall's grand opening was a festive event, complete with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, live music, and special discounts in every store. Among the crowd were 5 teenagers, Emily, Jake, Sarah, Mark, and Lily, who had eagerly anticipated the opening for weeks. They spent the day exploring the mall's various stores, trying on clothes, sampling food at the packed food court, and laughing as they teased each other about the items they couldn't afford. As the day turned into evening, the mall began to empty, with families heading home and store employees starting to close up shop. The group, still buzzing with energy, decided to explore the quieter, less crowded areas of the mall. They wandered into a corridor that seemed unusually deserted. The lights were dimmer here, and the air felt colder. As they walked, they began to hear a faint, childlike laughter echoing through the corridor. It was distant at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder as they moved forward. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice tinged with unease. "Yeah, it sounds like a little kid laughing," Jake replied, trying to sound casual but unable to hide the slight tremor in his voice. The laughter continued, bouncing off the walls and filling the empty space around them. The group followed the sound, expecting to find a child playing nearby. Instead, they came upon an old, disused play area. The area was roped off, the brightly colored ropes faded with age. A small sign hung on the rope, reading, "Closed for renovation." The play area was dark and eerily quiet. In the center stood an old carousel, its painted horses frozen in mid-gallop. The once vibrant colors were now muted, covered in a thin layer of dust. The laughter had stopped as soon as they arrived, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. "This place is creepy," Lily muttered, rubbing her arms as if to ward off a sudden chill. Emily, always the boldest of the group, stepped over the rope, ignoring the sign. "Come on, it's just an old play area. What's the worst that could happen?" As she approached the carousel, the others hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Emily reached out to touch one of the horses, and at that moment, the laughter resumed, this time, right behind her. She froze, her hand hovering just inches from the horse's painted mane. "Emily, get out of there," Mark urged, his voice low and urgent. Emily spun around, expecting to see a child or perhaps one of her friends playing a prank. But there was no one there. The corridor behind her was empty. A cold breeze suddenly swept through the area, causing the ropes to sway and the carousel to creak ominously. "I'm not staying here," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she grabbed Lily's hand and began to back away. Before anyone could respond, the carousel began to move. The music, slow and distorted, filled the air as the horses started to rotate. The sight of the carousel coming to life on its own sent a wave of terror through the group. "Run!" Jake shouted, and they didn't need to be told twice. The 5 of them bolted down the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent mall. They didn't stop until they were outside, gasping for breath in the cool night air. Once they were safely outside, they tried to laugh it off, convincing themselves that it was all just a strange coincidence, maybe a malfunction of some old machinery. But the experience haunted them, especially Emily. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching them, and that the laughter they heard wasn't just an echo of the past. The next day, still curious and unable to let it go, Emily did some research about the mall's location. She discovered that before Crescent Mall was built, the land had been home to a small amusement park called Wonderland. It had been a popular spot for families in the 1950s, but it was abruptly closed down after a tragic accident. A little girl had died on the carousel when it malfunctioned, and her grieving parents had sued the park, leading to its eventual closure. Emily's blood ran cold as she read the article. The carousel they had seen in the mall's abandoned play area looked exactly like the one from the old photographs of Wonderland. She realized that the mall had been built over the remains of the amusement park, and the play area must have been a preserved piece of that history. But what terrified Emily the most was the thought that the laughter they heard wasn't just a memory, it was the restless spirit of the little girl, still trapped in the place where she had met her untimely end. Emily never returned to that part of the mall, and she warned her friends to stay away as well. But the memory of that night, and the chilling laughter that echoed through the deserted corridor, stayed with them forever. The Vanishing Shopper. In the bustling city of Newbury, Westgate Mall was the place to be. Known for its high-end stores and chic boutiques, it attracted a well-heeled crowd who came to shop, dine, and be seen. The mall had a reputation for being a trendsetter, constantly updating its offerings to cater to the city's affluent residents. But beneath its glamorous facade, Westgate Mall held a dark and unsettling secret that would leave the city's residents questioning everything they thought they knew. Margaret Hawkins, a middle-aged woman with a love for antique shopping, had been visiting Westgate Mall regularly for years. She enjoyed browsing the shops, chatting with store owners, and occasionally indulging in a treat from the upscale bakery on the ground floor. On one of her usual weekend shopping trips, she noticed something strange, a store she had never seen before. The storefront was unlike anything else in the mall. It had an old-fashioned appearance, with large glass windows and a faded wooden sign that read, "The Curious Emporium." The display inside was equally peculiar, filled with odd trinkets, vintage toys, and dusty antiques. Margaret, who prided herself on knowing every corner of the mall, was intrigued. She couldn't recall ever seeing this store before, and it wasn't listed on the mall's directory. Curiosity piqued, Margaret decided to step inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, she was struck by how different the store felt compared to the rest of the mall. It was dimly lit, with the faint smell of must and old wood filling the air. The shelves were packed with an eclectic mix of items, from ancient books to porcelain dolls with cracked faces. An elderly man stood behind the counter, his expression neutral as he watched her enter. "Good afternoon," Margaret greeted him, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man nodded in response, his thin lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Margaret began to browse the shelves, fascinated by the strange collection of objects. There was an old music box that played a haunting tune, a set of tarnished silver spoons engraved with unfamiliar symbols, and a mirror with a frame so intricately carved it seemed almost alive. Despite her growing unease, she found herself drawn to the items, each one more curious than the last. As she reached out to touch a dusty old book with a leather cover, the lights in the store flickered. Margaret felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest, as if something had seized her heart. She gasped, clutching her chest, and everything around her seemed to blur. The last thing she saw was the old man's cold, emotionless gaze before everything went dark. When Margaret came to, she was lying on the cold, hard floor of the store. The air was thick with dust, and the dim light cast eerie shadows across the walls. Disoriented, she slowly got to her feet, only to find that the store seemed abandoned. The shelves were empty, covered in cobwebs, and the counter where the old man had stood was now covered in a thick layer of dust. Panicked, Margaret stumbled out of the store and back into the mall. To her horror, the once bustling mall was now deserted. The lights were dim, and the shops were all closed, their windows dark. She called out for help, but her voice echoed hollowly in the empty corridors. No one responded. Desperate, Margaret ran to the nearest exit, but when she pushed against the door, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the mall had sealed itself shut, trapping her inside. She banged on the glass, screaming for someone to hear her, but there was no one outside. The city beyond the mall seemed unnervingly still, as if time itself had stopped. Terrified and confused, Margaret returned to where the Curious Emporium had been, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening. But when she reached the spot, she found only a boarded-up storefront. The wooden boards were old and weathered, and a faded sign above the door read, "Closed permanently." Margaret's heart sank as she realized the truth. The store had been closed for decades, its existence erased from the mall's history. She remembered hearing rumors about the store when she was younger, stories of strange occurrences and people who had disappeared after visiting it. But she had always dismissed them as urban legends. Now, standing in front of the boarded-up store, Margaret understood that those stories had been true. The store had somehow reappeared, luring her inside, and now she was trapped. She wandered the empty mall, hoping to find a way out, but the exits remained sealed, and the mall's corridors seemed to stretch endlessly. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret began to lose track of time. The mall had become a labyrinth, and no matter how far she walked, she always ended up back where she started. She saw fleeting glimpses of people, shoppers passing by or mall employees locking up for the night, but when she called out to them, they vanished, leaving her alone once more. Margaret realized that she had become invisible, a ghost trapped between worlds. The mall continued to operate as usual, with shoppers and employees going about their daily routines, completely unaware of her presence. She was a specter, forever haunting the place she had once frequented, her cries for help unheard. As the years passed, the legend of the Curious Emporium grew, with new rumors spreading among the mall's visitors. Some claimed to have seen a strange, old-fashioned store that appeared and disappeared at random. Others spoke of a ghostly figure that roamed the mall at night, her desperate whispers echoing through the empty corridors. Margaret, now a part of the mall's dark history, could only watch as life went on without her, forever lost in the shadows of Westgate Mall. The Mirror Maze. In the early 1970s, the remote town of Blackwood was in desperate need of economic revitalization. To attract visitors and boost the local economy, a wealthy developer proposed the construction of a massive shopping complex on the outskirts of town. The project, dubbed Blackwood Plaza, was met with excitement by the townspeople, who hoped it would bring prosperity to their struggling community. The mall opened with great fanfare, featuring a variety of stores, a large food court, and several attractions designed to entertain visitors of all ages. Among these attractions was a funhouse complete with a mirror maze, a twisting, reflective labyrinth that promised to challenge and delight those who dared to enter. The mirror maze quickly became one of the mall's most popular features, drawing crowds eager to test their wits against the disorienting corridors. One Friday evening, as the mall prepared to close for the night, a group of friends, David, Lisa, Mike, Rachel, and Tom, decided to brave the mirror maze one last time. The group had grown up together in Blackwood, and they often spent their weekends at the mall, relishing the chance to escape the monotony of small-town life. The entrance to the mirror maze was lined with blinking lights and colorful signs, beckoning them inside. David, the group's de facto leader, grinned as he led the way, his friends following close behind. The moment they stepped inside, the world outside seemed to fade away, replaced by a maze of endless reflections. The walls of the maze were made entirely of mirrors, each one reflecting the image of the friends back at them, creating an infinite number of doppelgangers. The lights inside the maze were dim, casting long shadows that made it difficult to distinguish reality from reflection. As they moved deeper into the maze, the laughter and chatter of the group grew more subdued, replaced by nervous giggles and uneasy glances. "Are we sure this was a good idea?" Rachel asked, her voice echoing eerily through the maze. "Relax, it's just a funhouse," David replied, though even he couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that had settled over them. The maze was larger than they remembered, with more twists and turns than seemed possible. After several minutes of wandering, the group began to realize that they were hopelessly lost. Every turn seemed to lead them back to where they started, and the reflections in the mirrors only added to their confusion. The maze, which had initially seemed like a harmless diversion, was now beginning to feel like a trap. "Wait, didn't we pass this spot already?" Mike said, pointing to a smudge on one of the mirrors. "No way, it all just looks the same," Lisa replied, though her voice lacked confidence. As they debated which direction to take, David noticed something strange in one of the mirrors. A tall, shadowy figure stood in the distance, partially obscured by the reflections. At first, he thought it was just one of their reflections distorted by the angle of the mirror, but as he moved, the figure remained in place, unaffected by his movements. "Guys, do you see that?" David asked, pointing towards the figure. The others turned to look, their expressions shifting from confusion to fear as they too saw the figure. It was tall, with a gaunt, almost skeletal frame, its face obscured by shadows. The figure seemed to be watching them, its presence both menacing and unexplainable. "What the hell is that?" Tom whispered, his voice trembling. "Maybe it's just another part of the maze," Rachel suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. But as they moved forward, the figure didn't disappear. It seemed to move closer with each step they took, its dark silhouette growing larger and more defined. The group's pace quickened, their initial bravado now replaced by a growing sense of dread. The maze seemed to stretch on forever, each turn leading them further into a labyrinth of mirrors that reflected not only their images but also their growing fear. The shadowy figure was no longer a distant presence, it was now close enough that they could make out the details of its form, a tattered cloak, long, bony fingers, and hollow eyes that seemed to glow with a faint, unnatural light. Panic set in as they realized they couldn't find the exit. They were trapped, and the maze seemed to be toying with them, changing its layout each time they thought they were making progress. The mirrors no longer just reflected their images, they distorted them, turning their faces into grotesque caricatures of fear and despair. Lisa was the first to disappear. One moment she was walking beside them, and the next, her reflection was gone, replaced by the shadowy figure that had been stalking them. The others called out her name, their voices echoing through the empty corridors, but there was no response. It was as if she had been swallowed by the maze itself. One by one, the others began to vanish. Mike was the next to go, his terrified scream cut short as his reflection was replaced by the figure. Tom and Rachel tried to stick together, but the maze seemed to have a mind of its own, separating them at every turn until they too were taken by the shadow. David, now the last one left, was consumed by terror. He could hear the faint whispers of his friends, their voices distorted and distant, as if they were calling to him from another world. The shadowy figure was everywhere, reflected in every mirror, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Desperate, David ran through the maze, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he searched for an escape. But no matter how fast he ran, the mirrors always showed the same thing, his own terrified face, distorted and twisted by fear, and the figure that now loomed over him, its skeletal hand reaching out. Finally, David reached a dead end, the mirrors closing in on him from all sides. The figure was right behind him, its presence overwhelming. David's reflection stared back at him, his eyes wide with terror, as the figure's hand closed around him. The last thing he saw was his own reflection being pulled into the mirror, his face twisted in a silent scream. The next morning, the mall opened as usual, with shoppers and employees going about their day, completely unaware of the horror that had unfolded the night before. The mirror maze was cordoned off, with a sign reading, "Closed for maintenance." Rumors began to spread among the townspeople about the group of friends who had disappeared without a trace. Some claimed to have seen their reflections in the mirrors, their faces twisted in fear, forever trapped in the maze. Others spoke of a shadowy figure that haunted the funhouse, a malevolent spirit that fed on the fear of those who entered. Blackwood Plaza eventually closed down, unable to recover from the strange occurrences and the loss of visitors. The mall was left to decay, its once bright lights now flickering in the darkness. The mirror maze, long forgotten, still stands, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to enter and become part of its twisted reflections.